Hello and welcome back to another episode of Hollywood Wargaming. Today we are continuing our bolt action unit guide with the Forward Artillery Observer as we get into our HQ options here. And while this is a relatively niche unit overall, you will actually see him pretty frequently on the tabletop, as the British faction does have a national characteristic that allows them to carry one of these guys into battle for free every game. So it is something as a bolt action player that you should familiarize yourself with, as it's not only something you will likely come up against on the tabletop, but also something that is a bit of a draw for the British faction in general, and even the Soviet Union, as they do have a national characteristic that affects this unit, but that is something that we will touch more on later. To begin, let's go ahead and jump in and take a look at where this unit slots into your reinforced platoon. And forward observers are a sort of HQ option here that is going to have their own slot in the reinforced platoon. And this artillery observer will be competing with air observers and occasionally naval observers if your scenario allows it. However, as stated earlier, the British faction does get a free forward artillery observer, and that's actually taken in its own section in the British reinforced platoon. So you could, in theory, if you are a British player, run a forward artillery observer alongside another observer, be it air or naval, or even double dip and run two forward artillery observers, which is actually somewhat of a viable strategy. And getting into the raw stats, it is going to be a single model who is the forward observer, and he will cost you a pretty respectable 100 points or 115 points if taken as veteran. And much like your standard officer, he will be able to take a pistol, rifle, or submachine gun, and also be accompanied by up to 2 men at 10 points each for regular or 13 points per veteran. And those extra guys will of course be able to take rifle, pistol, or submachine guns also. Now, at just one model, you will be receiving the small team special rule, meaning you will get -1 hit from incoming fire. However, if you are going to be taking those 2 extra bodyguards, you will lose that bonus from the small team special rule. And ultimately, it is pretty pointless to take any bodyguards at all alongside your observer, as you're kind of just throwing away points. 10 points can get you 3 extra submachine guns and an assault unit or something else like that, and it's really just not well allocated here, be it on that already relatively expensive 100-point model or the free one you get with your British platoon. When we look at how the artillery strike call-in works later in this video, you'll realize that your officer doesn't have to be anywhere near the front line, and while you could, in theory, YOLO him into some close combat to try and finish off an enemy unit, which of course a couple of bodyguards with submachine guns would help with, it's much better to keep this guy out of the way and just keep him as an extra dice in your bag, especially if he's that free British observer, as he really does act as a nice anchor for your activation control when it comes to that dice bag, and throwing him away in combat for some sort of Hail Mary, be it even just a single extra pin, usually just simply is not worth it. And likewise, there's really no reason you should run this guy as veteran for extra 15 points. It's just a colossal waste of 15 points. It's best, in my opinion, to run this guy solo and as regular, keep him in the backfield, and let him do his business by calling in artillery strikes. Oh, and of course being that extra dice in the bag. But with one guy coming in at 100 points, there is of course more to this picture than just a single guy with a relatively standardized weapon profile. This model represents an observer radioing coordinates back to an artillery battery that is located far, far behind the front lines, who is going to call in shells to rain down on your enemy. So rather than having your army's artillery represented as, say, a medium howitzer on the battlefield, instead imagine maybe half a dozen of them on the backfield 2 miles away coming in to hit your enemy. Because of course, painting and playing with actual models is incredibly boring. I'd much rather have invisible things off the table come in and do the heavy lifting for me. Okay, but seriously, I will try and withhold my resentment for these mechanics for when I get to the air observer video. The artillery observer is definitely more palatable than some of the other options for your forward observers, in my opinion. He will essentially be operating as a standard infantry model. However, when he receives a fire order, he can instead put down an artillery marker for a call-in, and this can be placed anywhere on the battlefield within his line of sight. And this can be designated when placed to call in either an artillery strike or a smoke strike. Although, honestly, you're going to be calling in the artillery strike most of the time, because smoke is somewhat tactical but also rather janky in this game. And this artillery strike can only be called in once per battle, which means calling in smoke on your 100-point model is a pretty huge waste of points in my opinion. There might be some more thematic attack and defense scenarios where smoke is worth it, but we'll talk more about this when we get to smoke itself. Just know that when you receive a fire order, you can place an artillery token somewhere on the map, and you must designate at that time whether it's going to be a smoke or artillery strike. And that token will then remain there on the battlefield wherever you placed it until the beginning of the next turn. Now, at the beginning of the next turn, before any order dice are drawn, you will then roll a d6 and consult the relative chart, be it the artillery barrage or smoke barrage. And this roll will in turn inform what happens with your artillery strike, which of course is targeted on that marker that you previously placed. Now, on the artillery barrage chart, we do have 3 options here. The first one is going to trigger on a roll of 1. And this will be a miscalculation, aka your artillery target has misread the coordinates or there's been errors somewhere along the way. Maybe the shells are drifting a bit. But long story short, it's basically a miss. This will cause the artillery to drift in 3d6 inches in a random direction, and this random direction is decided by the classic scatter dice. And don't fret if you don't have any scatter dice in your collection, the bolt action order dice do actually have an arrow on each of the orders. So you can roll one of those die and it will determine which direction your marker is going to drift in, along with 3d6 dice, which will give you between 3 inches and a total of 18 inches, which is a pretty big disparity in distance, but it really creates a lot of randomness in how far that is going to drift. And of course, after it drifts, if it doesn't drift off the table, you will then resolve the artillery attack as if it hits. Now, I've played enough games of bolt action to see this go down in a lot of different ways. If it drifts off the table, then it completely vaporizes and misses the battlefield entirely, and I have seen that happen. And guess what? If you paid 100 points for that artillery officer and this happens, you're just SOL. On the other hand, there is the chance that it will actually drift back towards your units and hit your own guys, which of course is really bad because now you're paying 100 points for a unit that's hurting your own guys. However, I will say that I think I've only seen this happen once in my entire career of bolt action. And even then it wasn't terribly punishing, as we'll look at when we see the fire effect rules when the shells actually hit. But ultimately, you will find that even if you do get a miscalculation with that roll of 1, you will sometimes drift not terribly out of range and still clip a few enemy units. And I've even seen games where the miscalculation ends up being then where the shells would land if it got a perfect fire for effect. And we'll discuss more of that when we get into the meta of how to call in and actually use your artillery strikes, as there definitely is some strategy to how you place them on the battlefield for things like area denial. But next up on that roll of d6, you are going to have on a roll of 2 or 3 a delayed fire, which means basically the battery is too busy with other orders or they're just slow to react. So no artillery strike comes in this turn. However, if your observer is still alive, you can then move that marker somewhere else on the battlefield within 12 inches of its existing placement. And then next turn following this one, you will then again roll the d6 before any order dice are drawn and resolve the chart again. And while this may sound kind of unfortunate or even bad, it's arguably one of the best rolls you can get on the artillery chart. Again, we'll discuss this more later when we talk about placement strategies. But imagine just a big red laser target just chasing your enemy's units around the tabletop. I've seen games where the artillery gets delayed until turn 4 or 5. And the sheer stress of having that marker there threatening you with pins or even destruction is enough to really put the pressure on your enemy commander. But of course, if you do roll a 4, 5, or 6 when consulting this chart, you are going to get fire for effect, which means the artillery is coming in right on target, and the fireworks show will commence. And once the fire for effect is rolled and the shells are coming in, you will again roll another d6 and add 6 inches to it, and that will be the radius in which the artillery is dropping on the units there. And all units within this range will then have to roll off to see how the artillery affects them. On a roll of 1 through 5, the unit is not directly hit, but is a bit shell-shocked and takes d3 pin markers. However, when a 6 is rolled, that unit will count as being hit by a heavy howitzer shell, which of course is a 4-inch template and one of the most devastating attacks in the game. So to sum it up, when your artillery does come in, you're going to roll a d6, add 6 to that number, and all units within that number of inches from your marker are going to receive a quote-unquote hit. And for each of those units, you're going to roll a d6. On a 1 through 5, they receive d3 pins. On a roll of 6, they receive a heavy howitzer hit. So as you can tell, the whole thing's a bit of a lottery system. It does have the potential to do extreme damage with a heavy howitzer hit, especially if you consider that is going to be hitting the top armor on vehicles. But really, the way you should look at these artillery strikes is that you're going to be blanketing a 9-inch average area with d3 pin markers, which is definitely nothing to scoff at in the game of bolt action, where the game really does make or break on units being able to activate when receiving pins. And as we all know, once you get 2 pin markers on a unit, it does kind of start to get into the danger zone where they're going to be put out of action. And that's when you're going to force your opponent to make risky decisions. So yeah, a little AoE of pin markers with a chance to do some serious damage is definitely not bad. However, the big problem here is with reliability. As we know, it can either drift, be delayed, or sometimes even come in on a marker where your opponents have already scattered away from. It is, after all, an active token on the battlefield that sits there for a turn, and your opponent does have the option to try and move away from it. Or at least, at times they do. So, placing this artillery strike right in the middle of a huge group of enemies may not actually be the best move. Perhaps it is your first turn on the game and you did pull that order dice, and maybe you're going to get really lucky and at the beginning of the next turn you're going to get a 4, 5, or 6 on that roll and get fire for effect. And bam, your enemy is pinned down and they're going to spend the whole first turn rallying to get those pin markers off, and maybe even you blew up a unit. However, if there is a delay, you do get to move that marker, but your enemy can also move around it and outright evade it, really. But this is where the artillery barrage really does shine, in my opinion. It's better as an area denial tool or a looming threat than an actual kind of reliable way to harm enemies. The best way to use an artillery strike, in my opinion, is, yes, sometimes you do go for those big bunches. It can really punish things like Death Stars. But in most games, I do find it better to set it down on a turn where your enemy is trying to advance on an objective and have it a little bit in between you and your opponent, so when they try and advance on you, then they're under threat. So they have to choose, do they want to avoid the artillery or go for the objective? So when you're a commander controlling a forward artillery observer, you really have to think about your enemy's next move, and you also have to be really prepared for your artillery to not come in at all, and where you're going to place the token after that. You also just have to be prepared for really lackluster results. Perhaps your artillery does come in. Perhaps you only roll a 1 or a 2 on its distance, meaning you're 7 or 8 inches then. Perhaps you then don't roll too hot on those D3 dice for applying pins. Next thing you know, your 100-point unit has only dished out 2 or 3 pin markers, and I've definitely seen that happen. Ultimately, the forward artillery observer is rather random. It can be a bit of a casino, which can be sometimes pretty fun, but it can also be really feels bad if you're on the receiving end of it, because you're not actually really fighting other models. You're fighting one little guy who can occasionally just shut down your entire army and change the course of the game. And I don't think I'm being too controversial when I say that an off-field, non-existent unit kind of deciding the fate of a game is really not a great mechanic. Now, every now and then you get some fun fireworks shows where maybe it drifts around the whole game and then will blow up a lone tank at the end, and it doesn't necessarily shut down your opponent's army, but it also does do some cool stuff, and it does make for a really good story in those scenarios. And I will say that in most matches where I do see artillery observers deployed, they're not the worst. They tend to just dish out a few pins on a turn, and then, yeah, it slows you for some recovery, and it does feel relatively balanced overall. But honestly, there is a pretty ridiculous disparity between this unit feeling balanced when it's 100 points versus when it's completely free for the British. And I guess this is a good time to talk about national characteristics. As we've stated earlier, the British do get a free forward artillery observer. So you're not just getting that artillery attack pro bono, but you're also getting an extra dice in the bag because he does count as a unit on the table, which is honestly a huge bonus. I mean, it's probably one of the most powerful national traits in the game, and definitely a major point of discussion when people talk about the British favoritism in bolt action. And yes, this will actually allow you to stack 2 forward artillery observers in one match, meaning you'll have 2 tokens moving around the map, or perhaps hitting your enemy twice with them, which can be extremely devastating. But overall, as a British player, I think you are better off putting those 100 points elsewhere. It's a really, really, really powerful unit when it's free, but don't try and push it by saying it's a bargain at 2 for 100. I don't know if that makes sense, but it's just not a unit worth 100 points in my opinion. And while the double artillery officer can be imposing, I find that a 10-man rifle section tends to just give you more board control. And I've never really felt that the double artillery officer has imposed on me more so than just a single artillery officer. It feels like one of them always whiffs, and that's not a big deal if you have one that whiffs and it was free, but if you have 2 and you're paying 100 points and one of them whiffs, then it does kind of become a feels bad thing. But it's definitely not the worst way to build a British list, and if you play enough games with it, you're probably going to see some pretty spectacular things happen. But our good friends from the East do also have a national characteristic that is going to affect artillery barrages, and this will be the Soviet Union's massed guns special rule. And basically here, when you roll that d6 for your range or radius of your artillery barrage and add it to 6, you can roll 2d6 and pick the highest number. That's going to help ensure that you get the largest AoE when your shells do come in. But overall, I do find this to be a relatively weak national characteristic. It's a bit of damage control coming at the end of the pipeline for the artillery barrage. And because of that, I feel like it only increases the reliability of this unit to a smaller degree. And ultimately, it does not do a lot to tempt me to include a forward artillery observer in a Soviet list. And while recording this, I actually went back and revisited my old faction review video for the Soviet Union to see what I had to say about this national characteristic. And I was actually much more positive on it for the kind of thematic and lore reasons. I guess you wouldn't really call it lore, maybe more history. But the more thematic reasons, I was more positive on this than the British officer. But at the same time, I still only ranked it 2 out of 5 because it's not very useful. And I think in retrospect, giving it 2 out of 5 is pretty generous. I'd probably do it 1 out of 5 nowadays. It's just not that great. I think I just gave it that because thematically I like the idea of people getting a better unit should they choose to take it, rather than the British method of just, you're always going to take this artillery observer. I think that's kind of just cheesy and not a great way to build a rule system. But overall, forward artillery observer, what do I think about him? Well, he is an amazing unit when he's free. So it's just kind of a British thing. Other than that, I don't really think it's worth 100 points. It's an off-table casino mechanic that's relatively balanced, but also can create some pretty feels-bad scenarios. But admittedly, it does also create some pretty crazy stories that happen sometimes when you do land those amazing artillery strikes that come in on turn 5 after being delayed again and again. It's definitely not the worst thing. I played British 8th Army myself, so I have plenty of experience using this. I also had a friend in my old group, shout out to Pepper Pete's, who always played British and also rolled the hottest dice I've ever seen. And while the artillery could get pretty annoying from time to time, I never felt that it was too overbearing, and I never really felt like once I got hit by it, I couldn't come back from the match. Maybe there was 1 or 2 times, but for the most part, it does feel pretty balanced. I'm still just not big on the whole models that don't actually exist doing huge impact on the tabletop. And I know there's a lot of people who are far less ambivalent about the artillery strikes than I am. I know there's a lot of people out there who just absolutely hate them and will say that the artillery observer is not only worth 100 points, but absurdly OP when it's free for the British. And while I will agree with that later part, I definitely still don't think they're worth 100 points on their own, as they are just rather unreliable and a bit swingy. But like I said, I've played a lot of games in bolt action, both with and against artillery officers, so maybe I'm just kind of, a hardened veteran who knows how to just grit my teeth and run through the smoke of incoming artillery shells. Oh, speaking of smoke, I totally forgot about the smoke barrage chart, as most other players forget that they can call in smoke in this game. Yeah, smoke acts the exact same way as the artillery barrage chart, except when it does come in, instead of an explosion, you're obviously getting smoke, which comes in as a 6-inch radius and blocks line of sight, and then confers to the smoke rules, which I'm not going to cover in this video, because they're honestly a pain in the ass. Smoke is very much a usable mechanic in this game, and it does have its place in the battlefield, and I'm sure some commanders use it to great effect, but it's a total waste when it's coming from a 100-point model. And if I really want to torture myself by sitting down and covering smoke and how smoke works, it's going to be in its own video, and you guys are really going to have to beg for me to do that one because it's one of the most forgotten mechanics in bolt action to begin with. But yeah, smoke barrage. Anyways, if you guys enjoyed the video, consider leaving a like, subscribing to the channel if you're not already, and leave a comment down below. Let me know the craziest thing that's happened with an artillery strike. I want to know what vehicles got blown up by a howitzer shell hitting that top armor. I want to know how many pins were dished out. I want to know it drifted to the backfield and blew up your own officer. Let me know the details. These casino mechanics can be really annoying when you've set up a game for like an hour and played it just for it to go down the drain with a silly artillery strike, but it does make for pretty good stories later on. And if I seem a little bit irate with the artillery forward observer and how I perceive its rules mechanics as written, just wait until the air observer with my next video, because I might be yelling the entire video. But as always, until next time, take care.